It's Thursday, January 8th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, an ICE officer shoots and kills a woman in Minneapolis in broad daylight in an entirely predictable tragedy, one that might be a tipping point against the Trump administration's cornerstone law enforcement agency. So I'm going to break down what we know by going through video evidence and the law, what the response has been from the White House, the administration, as well as state and local leaders, and why this particular horrific incident is different from other ones we've seen so far. But first, make sure you're following or subscribe to the show. Become a subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new piece out about how Donald Trump is acting as a prospector president, a minor-in-chief, if you want to call him that, and his actions and interests in countries around the world are driven by digging for buried treasure. But that is just for paid subscribers. You can become a monthly subscriber for just $5 a month. You can get access to weekly original reporting, the things you forgot from civics class newsletter, and the subscriber-only chat. Okay, when I come back, the shooting in Minnesota. It's January, which means half the country is doing dry January, and the other half is asking, does wine count if I'm mad at the news? If you've ever tried dry January, you know the problem isn't willpower, it's standing in your kitchen at 9 p.m. holding a can of seltzer and promising yourself it's the same if you close your eyes and ignore your sense of taste. Well, that's where RSRV Collective Botanical Drinks come in. RSRV makes non-alcoholic beverages with plant-based ingredients, so you'll still get that feeling, just without the hangover, the regret, or waking up to text messages you don't remember sending. It still feels like a drink. It still feels like a ritual. You don't black out during the documentary you were pretending to watch. Dry January, at least for me, isn't about suffering or even really sobriety. It's about a reset at the beginning of the year after a few months of the holidays where we all rightfully celebrated. Right now, you can get 30% off your next order from RSRV Collective with the code in the show notes. Mims does get a cut of that, but it helps support the show, stay up and running. So if you're doing dry January or you're just taking a break from alcohol, check out RSRV Collective Botanical Drinks. Same vibe, fewer apologies. All right, let's get on with the show. On Wednesday, ICE agents descended on a neighborhood in Minneapolis. They were part of a surge of around 2,000 officers who had been sent into the largest city in the state of Minnesota after a right-wing YouTuber claimed to have uncovered hundreds of millions of dollars in social services fraud happening in the state. The truth of his videos were that he didn't uncover anything new. The Department of Justice and the state of Minnesota were already working to catch the people responsible and had been doing that for a decade. And then he was also invited by the head of the Republican Party in order to make the governor of Minnesota end his campaign to be reelected, which worked. But that aside, these ICE agents were supposedly conducting some kind of door-knock raid in this neighborhood. Neighbors came out of their homes to protest in a safe distance for everyone, not unlike anything that we haven't seen in other parts of the country. And then, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen, a wife, a mother, a woman named Renee Good was in her Honda Pilot in the middle of the street. Now, it's unclear right now how or why she was there. Some reports say she was pulling out of her driveway and trying to turn around. Others say she accidentally ended up on the street, at least in that part, and then got blocked in by ICE and was trying to turn around. But that also doesn't really matter. What does is that at one point she is seen waving ICE agents past her, around her, so that she can turn around. A group of officers get out of an unmarked truck, walk up to her SUV, one of them directly in front of it, stopping there. They then try to order her to get out of her car, which she doesn't have to do. They then try to open her door from the outside and appear to be trying to reach inside at one point to open it without a warrant or probable cause. And then she begins to pull away, and the officer in the front of her car fires 3 times. First, through her windshield, and 2 more times through her open driver's side window at point-blank range. One of those shots killing Renee Good. When you look at the video from multiple angles and sync them up, which I did, I must have seen Good's death at this point 25 times, if not more. The ICE officer is clearly out of the way of the SUV by the time he's firing at least, the very least, his second shot, which is important. It's also important to note that Good's SUV is clearly attempting to move away from the officer based on where her tires are pointing and the car goes. After the shooting, the neighborhood, understandably, erupts in anger and heartbreak, but remains incredibly somehow peaceful. Good's SUV, after she was shot, careened into a parked car where her body was left for several minutes, and then this video happened.
Somebody that's medically trained is pronouncing this woman dead.
For those of you not watching this, that is a man who came forward who says he was called over by either another neighbor or another officer on scene, because there were also Minneapolis police officers there as well, who says he's a doctor who had to check if Good was still alive. Instead, around a half dozen ICE officers pointed their guns at him, while no other officers were rushing to help Good, only saying that they had their own medics and that an ambulance was on the way. Those medics, at that point, were nowhere to be seen, and an ambulance would get there, but it would take 15 more minutes. When it did arrive, a witness told NBC News, quote, "They were on foot when they got through, and they carried her out just like by her limbs. They didn't even have a stretcher. She was carried out like a sack of potatoes." Also by that time, the ICE officer who was not hit by Good's car walked away from the scene and disappeared. In Minnesota, under state law, law enforcement have a duty to render aid to a gunshot victim. Witnesses also have a duty to render aid. So for those of you saying, well, just because that guy said he was a doctor doesn't mean he actually was, and you're right, but he was also stopped from following the law by law enforcement. And that same guy yelling that Good can't be declared dead by law enforcement officers is right. Under Minnesota law, officers are not allowed to declare someone dead, meaning under the law, they have to continue giving someone aid until a doctor, an advanced registered nurse, a physician's assistant, medical examiner, or coroner pronounces that person dead. So that is a lot of things that went wrong that would warrant in any normal world that the officer who fired the shots be placed on leave or suspended, and an investigation into exactly what happened after the shooting would continue. But there are also some serious problems for this officer with the shooting itself. Under the Department of Homeland Security's own use of force policy, which says officers should seek to employ tactics and techniques that effectively bring an incident under control while promoting the safety of law enforcement officers and the public, and that officers should also avoid intentionally and unreasonably placing themselves into positions where they have no alternative to using deadly force. It also says they have no duty to retreat, but that comes after the part that says they have to avoid putting themselves in harm's way that would force them to use deadly force. And the officer here is clearly standing in front of the vehicle, which is also against how law enforcement has been trained for the last 20 years, because in front of a car with a potentially agitated person behind the wheel, that's a dangerous place to be. Then there's the Department of Justice rules, and even though ICE is a DHS agency, DOJ law enforcement rules can also apply to them. Those rules say that officers cannot open fire on a driver unless, quote, the vehicle is operated in a manner that threatens to cause death or serious physical injury to that officer or others, and no other objectively reasonable means of defense appears to exist, which includes moving out of the path of the vehicle. I know that was long. What that means is that according to the Department of Justice, and these rules have been in place since 2022 and have not changed, that officer had a duty to move out of the way before firing his weapon. That rule and the DHS rule follow two Supreme Court rulings from the 1980s, Graham v. Connor and Tennessee v. Garner, both of which say an officer is not allowed to fire on a fleeing vehicle just because it's driving away, and that officers' reasons for firing need to be taken in a reasonable understanding of the facts and circumstances, not just the officer's interpretation of what happened. And now, there are a lot of people saying, including the president, the vice president, who you'll hear from in a minute, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, who you'll also hear from, and the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, all saying the first shot was justified under all those rules and rulings, and that may well be true. Though there's still the element of him putting himself in harm's way by standing in front of the car. But it's the second and third shots directly into the open window when the officer is in the clear that violate all of those things that I just laid out. In the hours after, Minnesota officials held a press conference and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey said this.
But I do have a message for our community, for our city, and I have a message for ICE. To ICE, get the fuck out of Minneapolis. We do not want you here. Your stated reason for being in this city is to create some kind of safety, and you are doing exactly the opposite. People are being hurt. Families are being ripped apart. Long-term Minneapolis residents that have contributed so greatly to our city, to our culture, to our economy are being terrorized, and now somebody is dead. That's on you.
That is by far the most direct message from a local leader to ICE and the administration about ICE that we have heard in the last year. And also, not for nothing, but it definitely isn't the Minnesota nice that I think a lot of people were expecting here. It also, on top of all of that, signals an escalation may be coming in resistance from specifically Democratic leaders to ICE deployments in their cities going forward. But we'll talk about that a little later. The state's governor, Tim Walz, then gave the National Guard a warning notice, basically a heads up that he might deploy them, likely trying to block the president from trying to federalize Minnesota troops. And then the president weighed in. He wrote on Truth Social, "The woman driving the car violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer," which is not true. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, said this at her own press conference.
It was an act of domestic terrorism. What happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and ram them with her vehicle.
Again, not true, and an escalation in calling it domestic terror. And then today, J.D. Vance, the vice president, accused Good of being a left-wing agitator, blamed her for her own death, attacked the press for accurately reporting what happened, and said the officer who killed her should be thanked. And just so you know, these clips are split into two parts, so you're not hearing them in the way that they were said back to back, but they were said at the White House press briefing today.
He's been assaulted, he's been attacked, he's been injured because of it. He deserves a debt of gratitude, and I think the media prejudging and talking about this guy as if he's a murderer is one of the most disgraceful things I've ever seen from the American media. Yeah, America. What that headline leaves out is that that woman is part of a broader left-wing network to attack, to dox, to assault, and to make it impossible for our ICE officers to do their job.
So Vance is talking about the allegations that this officer is the same one who was dragged during another traffic stop 6 months ago that caused him to have stitches and hurt his legs. But he also is trying to imply here that if you don't know that this guy was run over in some way, which just isn't true. But what Vance is doing here is something called DARVO. It's a kind of rhetoric that's used in politics, but it's also used frequently by people like domestic abusers. It stands for deny, attack, reverse victim order. What it means is after you're accused of doing something, at first you deny the reality of what happened, like saying the officer was run over when he wasn't. And then you attack, say you call it domestic terror. And then you switch to being the victim, like saying the officer should be commended and that the person he shot was a left-wing activist, an enemy. It's really, really effective in flipping the script on people because it forces the people with the original true story to debunk what's just been said, while also at the same time furthering the lies that are being told and making the people with the true story look defensive. And in the court of public opinion, defensive people are never innocent. DARVO is a particular favorite tool of this White House. It reframes reality, and in the hands of people who are really good at it, like the president and vice president, who will just hammer away at it, it either splits people into two groups based on the things that they believe or who they support, or more often, people just get so exhausted trying to figure out what's true, they just give up trying to know what's true. And that cannot happen here. What is happening right now is there's an investigation underway, except Minnesota officials are now being barred from accessing evidence and from the entire investigation itself that's being collected by the FBI, which took over sometime last night or early this morning. That's according to the governor and the state's top investigating agency, which both have been calling for transparency here. Meaning the official report about what happened will come solely from an administration that's already called this officer a hero. There are also renewed calls for ICE to be investigated over its tactics, because this isn't the first time an officer has shot someone while they were in their car. Officers also shot at a woman in Chicago who was in her car earlier this year, who was accused of ramming her car into ICE SUVs, and video does seem to imply that that's what was happening, but she was also being egged on by the officer who shot her to escalate the situation. In both instances, the same ICE commander, a guy named Greg Bovino, was in charge. He's been accused of ordering and encouraging aggressive tactics from his officers, so much so that a federal judge issued a warning about him in her opinion about ICE in Chicago late last year, saying his testimony over ICE's tactics was not credible, accusing him of outright lying about either using excessive force or being attacked in the line of duty to justify the use of that force. There are also calls to investigate the training of ICE's new recruits, because so far ICE has received more than 200,000 applications for people to be officers, and they've given out around 18,000 offers. But a former ICE director under Obama told the Washington Post this week, the way new hires are being recruited is by emphasizing excessive force and reckless behavior, saying applicants are being sold on the idea of, quote, the quicker we can get out there and run over people, the better off this country will be. About which she said, that mentality you're fostering tends to inculcate people to a certain aggressiveness that may not be necessary in 85% of what you do. Effectively saying that ICE is purposefully recruiting people who actively want to be overly aggressive or reckless. And when you add that to a commander who has been found to make up reasons for ICE to be aggressive or reckless, and signals from the administration that there is no circumstance in which your actions won't be defended, and the investigation into those circumstances will be kept inside the administration, it makes for a powder keg of a situation wherever ICE is. And that leads to the last thing I want to talk about in this episode. Because as ICE was leaving the neighborhood where Renee Good was shot, protesters began throwing snowballs, which feels like something that could only come from a story out of Minnesota in the middle of January. But the images of it struck me, because what you have is armed, uniformed officers of the state occupying a neighborhood amid an angry group of residents who then threw snowballs. And that is also the story of another major moment in American history. In 1770, British Army Private Hugh White was standing on the corner of King Street in Boston, Massachusetts, near the Customs House, in what was at the time basically the center of the city. He was approached by a group of angry colonists who began shouting and taunting, and then there was some pushing and shoving, and then someone pelted White with a snowball, and he called out for help. What followed was the Boston Massacre, the catalyst for the American Revolution. Now, I'm not saying what happened to Renee Good is the start of a new revolution in any way. What I am saying is that we've been here before, and it doesn't end well for the people being hit with the snowballs. All right, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcast. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications if you're a watcher on YouTube. Leave a comment below. It really helps out the show and boosts it on that platform. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack for just $5 a month and get that brand new article all about how Donald Trump is acting like a prospector president. It's really interesting. I think you'll like it. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.